Hello everybody, my name is Zeke. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be kind of a follow-up vlog to the video I recently made about the New York Times Best Books of the 21st Century, the top 100 list that they made. I would definitely recommend checking out that video if you haven't already, but also feel free to not do that and instead stay for this. What makes this different is in the last video I talked about the books I had already read on that list and I kind of gave my opinions on them. But now at the end of that video I picked out some books from the list that I hadn't read that I was interested in and that I thought I could acquire very easily. Because I didn't want to put any barriers on making this video, and now I'm going to read a bunch of books from the list that I haven't read and see if I like them and see if the New York Times has taste, and hopefully I'll have a very subjective conclusion to that by the end of this video. So just as an introduction, I'll talk about the books I'm going to read. I'm going to start with the three I actually picked out in that video. First is Evicted by Matthew Desmond. I had to check my little list for the author name. This is a nonfiction book that I don't know much about, but I think it chronicles a reporter who went and interviewed a bunch of people who were struggling to keep a roof over their heads, and it's kind of an investigative nonfiction work. Excited to read that. I'm also planning on reading Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This I really know nothing about other than that it's 600 pages, and also we basically switch timelines a bunch of times from different stories that are all loosely related in some way, or maybe tightly related. I have no idea, I haven't read the book. Then also I have 10th of December, which is a short story collection by George Saunders. The little I know about this is that the stories are kind of stranger, weirder, and also it's from a time period I usually don't read short stories from, which is like the early 2000s. I feel like all the short stories I read are either old or very, very new, and so I'm kind of excited to see what I think about this one. So I think I'm gonna start with 10th of December actually, because I'm in the mood for some short stories, and so I will get right into that and update you when I have a little more to say. Okay, I've been reading 10th of December. I've read about 4 stories, and so far it's going very well. I was exactly right with the guess that these were going to be kind of unsettling stories that touched on darker and deeper themes, and that's exactly what I've gotten so far. So I think there are really 2 things that make these stories so unsettling so far. First of all is the actual content, just going through the stories I've read. The first one is like a kidnapping story that is kind of twisted and kind of concerning as it goes on, and especially the ending. Obviously I'm not going to give too much away because they're short stories, but it just goes in a direction that is deeply unsettling. The second one is like a 2-page one that just chronicles this man who dresses up like a pole out in his yard to show his emotions, and it's very strange. Then there was one about these people who, instead of going to jail, they've committed awful crimes. They are kind of used as scientific experiments to test different drugs and make them do different concerning things. And then there was one about these 2 families, one who is going to adopt a dog from the other family, and once they arrive at the house, everything is not exactly as it seems, and it's about like their 2 different perspectives, I guess, on everything going on. So those are unsettling enough on their own, and I think just those like loose descriptions kind of give you an idea of the type of like weirdness you can get in these, but also what I think makes them like above and beyond is the writing. The writing is very unique, it's very stylized. It's not quite stream of consciousness, it's not like long paragraphs of just like thoughts spewing at you, but it does incorporate a lot of that kind of writing. It's not like exactly that, but it takes the parts I like out of stream of consciousness, which is this like very personal, in-depth look at what a character is thinking about, how they're seeing the world, without like making it impossible to read, which I really appreciate. And I think having this like really up close and personal look with this kind of very stylized writing in these unsettling stories just makes it that much more unsettling, because we see so well how these characters think and what's going on in their brains, and it's just creepy, especially when they're put in these really strange situations and they have to kind of navigate through that. And it's something where these situations, they seem very strange to us from the outside, but they're often like almost normalized to the characters, or the way they see it is almost like detached from reality, at least the way that the writing makes it come across. And I think that is deeply unsettling in its own right. I don't know if I did a good job at explaining that, but I think it is something you kind of just have to read and like see to understand. But I'm really, really enjoying it, and I'm excited to read the other stories in this collection now, because they're all, so far, I've loved every single one of them. I think they're very engaging, and the writing style is really, really working for me. So I'm really glad I picked this up, and I'm expecting to find some more that I really enjoy, and I will update you when I've read a little more, or maybe when I'm done. We'll see how it goes and when I want to say things. Okay, I actually finished 10th of December a few days ago, but I do want to finally actually check in and talk about all the short stories that I really loved in this collection, and it ended up being incredible. I'm very glad I picked this up. I think the first two stories really helped set the tone for the rest of them. I think it was a very cohesive collection. I think that he has a very distinct style, and I don't really know if that style is the same throughout all of his books and all of his short story collections, but definitely in this group of short stories, they definitely felt very unique because of how he writes them, and I think he's just so good at setting tone using his writing that it just really pays off. I think reading it as a collection has a lot of benefits because they kind of build this whole world, even though they're all distinct stories. Because they have this similar tone and this similar writing, you really get engrossed in it in a way that I think it sometimes is hard to be so engrossed in a short story collection, because you're constantly switching from story to story. With that being said, let me talk about some of the ones I really loved. There was one in here about, well, we don't really know exactly what it was about, but it's kind of this like internal memo in this sort of company, and it's very ominous, and we're kind of finding out what this company does, and it's definitely something ominous, but we never really get a lot of answers. It was pretty short, but once again, the tone in that was just really unsettling and creepy in a very subtle way. And then I think the big standout in here is called The Simplica Girl Diaries. This one, I don't want to give away too much, because I think part of what makes it so incredible is the way we subtly learn what's going on. Once again, big theme is subtlety. But basically, we're following this family who is lower middle class. They're not necessarily thriving, they're surviving, but we are following like these diary entries of this father who really just wants more for his kids. He wants more for his family. And we kind of open when they're attending this birthday party at this really, really wealthy family's house. They have all these things, and they have one thing specifically that we don't really know a lot about. It's kind of introduced to us with an initial, and when I was reading, I just kind of brushed it off. I was like, okay, maybe I'm just missing something. But steadily, like, we find out more about what these SGs are, Simplica Girls, and it's a really interesting commentary on class and society, because we have this like direct, easily recognizable relationship between like a lower middle class family and a very wealthy family, and like that dynamic. But then we have this added element that we learn more about that I think was just so masterfully done, and I absolutely loved it, and I'm very, very glad I read it. That's probably one of my favorite short stories ever. It was incredible. I'd say the other two standouts were, there's this one where this guy works at some sort of like medieval reenactment job, entertainment gig, and he witnesses something awful go down between his boss and one of his coworkers, and then he kind of is forced to act, and he gets like a forced promotion to kind of keep him silent, and things kind of go awry. It's another short one, but I think it packs a big punch, and I'm sorry for being vague because obviously they're short stories, I don't want to give too much away. And then lastly, the last story was another really, really incredible one, probably my second favorite from the entire collection. It's the title story, 10th of December. It's about this young boy who's wandering around the woods in the middle of winter, and he comes across an older, terminally ill man, although he doesn't like know it at the time, and we're basically just following their thoughts, and they're both there for different reasons with different motivations, and we learn about the man's backstory, and then there's an event that happens and it kind of incites their meeting, and it was just really emotional and heartfelt and depressing, but also just very powerful. And I think especially as a like ending story, I was very happy and it felt very satisfying, and so that was another standout. And once again, I struggle to give short story collections 5 stars because I feel like there's always going to be one or two that are like not as amazing as the others, but I think this is probably one of, if not my favorite short story collection I've ever read. I know that's kind of crazy to say, but it just like reflecting on all of the stories, they were just so great. And I wonder how they'll hold up with time, because my issue always with collections like this is as I get further and further from them, I remember less and less, which is true for anything, but I think especially with short stories. So I'm going to leave this at like a 4.5 for now, and I'll see how I feel in a few months. If I'm still thinking about it, might move up to a 5, but wow, absolutely blew me away, and I'm so glad I read this, and I will give the New York Times list this point because they definitely knew what they were talking about with this one. So with that being said, I did mention that it is a few days later because I was kind of busy, I didn't have time to film, but I did also start reading Evicted. So I'm very not that far in. I think about like 40 pages, a little less, of like a 400-page book. I did not realize it was that long. I don't remember how much I mentioned, but basically we're following a wide cast of characters in Milwaukee, kind of acting as a symbolic representation of the wider United States and issues with housing in the wider United States, but specifically focused in Milwaukee. So far, we've mainly been following like 2 people, but it's a piece of nonfiction, but it feels very fiction-like in the way it's written and the way it's presented to us. It's very readable, and I will chime in when I have more thoughts. I don't know, I'm not gonna have the easiest time talking about this because it is nonfiction and it's hard to kind of talk about it like a story, because yes, it's a story, but also it's real and it happened to real people. But as I get further in, as I have more thoughts to say, I will definitely keep you updated, and I expect really big things from this one as well. So I hope that goes well, and I guess we will both find out very soon. Okay, so I'm pretty far into Evicted. It's actually not as long as I thought. I thought it was 400 pages. It's more around like a little over 300, and then a lot of it is like footnotes, or like endnotes, which I didn't realize before. But so far, I mean, I can't say I'm enjoying it because it's like not something you enjoy reading, but it's really good. So for some more context, we're basically split into 3 parts that detail different, I think the first one's called Brent, the second one's called Out, and then the third one's called After. And we're basically following a bunch of different perspectives. All these perspectives have to do with the incredibly unjust housing system in Milwaukee and across the United States, and how just impossible it is to get out of these awful poverty-stricken situations, because the systems that should be helping people are absolutely so beyond messed up and work to keep people in these situations. So, you know, it's not light stuff, obviously, and it's pretty depressing, but we're following people all along the chain. We follow a landlord. I think we started with the landlord, and we follow some of her tenants, and then we follow a bunch of people at this trailer park. We're following people across racial boundaries, and we're following the landlord who has more money but is not necessarily like super stable, but she's okay. It's a lot of switching back and forth, but I feel like I get lost a little bit sometimes. I'm a little forgetful of who's who, but I can get back on track pretty easily because all of the stories are so well told, even though I feel weird saying that because they're like real things that happen. But the way the book is structured, I think is very well done. We are basically split between these kind of narrative accounts of what's happening, and then when there's something more concrete to touch upon, the author will kind of insert their own knowledge into the situation about certain structures and certain systems and how they actually work, and they kind of help explain the situation and give more context, which I think is very well done. And I just think getting to see this mixture of just really depressing narrative mixed with the also equally depressing context surrounding the narrative just makes the whole experience really difficult to read, but also it has a lot of staying power. I think I'm not going to remember every little statistic or every little injustice that I'm learning about in the book, but I'm going to remember a lot of it, and I'm going to be supplemented by the narrative accounts that are so visceral and really add that like emotional aspect that makes it read a lot like just another novel. And then you remember that, no, this is very real. And I think just the way the whole book is structured with that switching really helps highlight that and make it kind of at least stay with me. And I think I'm really appreciative of that. And it's a very powerful book because of that. So I think I have around 100 pages left, and I'm sure it'll just be more of the same. I don't think I necessarily have a ton to talk about specific content-wise, because I feel like you just read these narratives and they kind of help give this wider context. But if I have, I'll obviously touch in when I'm done with the book and kind of give any final thoughts I have. But so far, I'm really glad I picked this up because I feel like I'm getting a lot out of it, even if obviously it's not enjoyable to read. Okay, I'm now officially like actually done with Evicted, and it was really just incredible, honestly. So everything I said before just remained really good. I think how he crafted the narrative remained really strong through the end. This book doesn't have like a happy ending. Obviously, it's talking about real people. It is a snapshot of their lives. It is not meant to have like a satisfying conclusion. And narratively, it really doesn't. We kind of just come to an ending point. But beyond that, what really elevated this book for me was actually the last two sections, the epilogue and the like about this project section that he added on to the end. So I really appreciated the epilogue because it kind of took us beyond the veil of like these narratives about these people and really focused in on the actual statistics, the actual information, the actual extent of the housing crisis and poverty, and how linked housing is to poverty, and how eviction is not just a like effect of poverty but a cause of poverty. And it really just crafted that argument very well, and like almost an essay that felt almost separate from the rest of the book. It obviously is talking about the same thing, but it feels like removed from it, and I wasn't really expecting that from the epilogue. But I really appreciated it. Also, it put forth like solutions, which I really appreciated. And I just think it elevated everything I'd read before, even beyond, because I really appreciated that he took the time to actually go beyond this snapshot and really extrapolate a really well thought out argument for how important housing is to just solving so many issues across this country. And then after reading the epilogue, I thought I was done because I didn't realize the about the project like section was like real. I thought it was gonna be like 2 pages, and then I saw that it was like 30, and I was like, okay, I have to read this. And I really, really enjoyed that. He's basically breaking the fourth wall entirely, telling us about the process of writing the book, his process of going into this community and actually talking to these people and like living side by side with them and following them around and interviewing them. And also kind of some of the background research he was doing through all of that, which I thought was just really interesting to learn about. He conducted like studies because there just wasn't a lot of data about evictions and its effect on poverty. And so he really just had to like forge his own path in the field. And I found like learning about all of that really interesting. And I also loved how he still made sure to center the actual people, and he was like, this is not about me, this is about them. If you take anything away from this book, remember their stories. And I thought that was a really powerful kind of ending to the whole book. And once again, I just think this will stick with me for a long time. I don't really rate nonfiction books because it doesn't really feel like right, but this would get a 5-star. I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's like outdated because it is about like 2009. It came out in 2016, but it's still really relevant, and nothing, like, things haven't really drastically changed. So I think it's still very, very relevant. And also, this has just reminded me that there's so much amazing nonfiction out there that isn't hard to read and is still so important to read. And it just reminded me that I need to read more of it. And yeah, and I think that in and of itself is a win. But also, I'm just really glad I was able to read this incredible book, and I wouldn't have read it without this list. So another point to the New York Times. So now I'm gonna start Cloud Atlas pretty soon, which is going to be a journey. I can already tell. It's not 600 pages in my edition. It's a Kindle edition that's like a little more than 500. Still pretty long. And once again, this is like goes forward in narrative through like little snapshots of different like novellas almost, and then we'll go all the way back to the first one, is my understanding. But I'll check in once I have something to talk about. Okay, so I'm actually about to film another video, but I thought that first, while I had everything set up, I would check in about Cloud Atlas. I'm gonna be honest, when I started reading it, I was not a huge fan. I'm currently 3 sections in. After reading the first section, I was kind of a little bit underwhelmed, but also still hopeful because I knew it was broken up into a bunch of different stories. So I was hopeful that the following stories would be more interesting to me, and they were. But also, now reflecting on that first story, I don't think it was necessarily bad. Like, it was fine. It just didn't immediately grip me. But now, as everything has gone on more and I've kind of gained more information and more things have happened in the other 2 sections I've read, I'm kind of more interested in that original story, which I think is a great benefit. But let me backtrack a little because I feel like I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Basically, the 3 stories I've read so far, I don't know what to call them. I think I'm going to stick with sections. So the first section, we're following this man who is kind of in this white colony in like near New Zealand, is my understanding of it. I'm a little vague on that. And it's talking about the relationship between 2 indigenous peoples and the white colonizers, and then also him kind of leaving this island and going onto a boat and having a journey on the boat, and then it just cuts off at a certain point. And so throughout all of it, it's kind of told in like a travelogue. I didn't feel like there was a lot going on, but he kind of develops an illness and he's being treated for that, and then it cuts off. And so after that, I was like, okay, I don't really know what to expect, like, fine, whatever. I think what contributed to that a lot was it is told in a very stylized way. It feels like it is like this kind of diary log written by a man in the 1800s that is kind of a little annoying to read and not the most immediately gripping, which I think is also kind of hard to critique because it's really putting it in that world. And I'm kind of really impressed with this book so far, because from there we then move into 2 sections that are completely different. The second one was interesting. It was about this like kind of deadbeat composer who goes and seeks out one of his idols who's kind of aged and withering away, and he starts to live with him and they work together. And throughout this whole time, he's sending letters back to a friend of his, a lover maybe. It's kind of unclear until later on. And so that in and of itself is a very stylized form of writing. These letters feel like letters, as obviously they would. They're written as letters, but it's very far removed from the writing style of that first section. And that is also like a little slower. We're kind of just following him as he gets ingrained within this new life. But I was more engaged and I was more interested in the story. And then we get to the third section, which we really got way past it. We like skipped ahead 50 years or so. And we're following a kind of investigation, this reporter who's going to investigate this company that has some shady things going on. They're trying to bring nuclear energy to the forefront, and they're like opening up a new reactor. and there's some shady stuff going on. And so we follow her investigation. And this one I was really, really engaged by. I think it's kind of like a run-of-the-mill kind of mystery, but what I keep coming back to is there's these little hints sprinkled throughout from the previous two sections, and it's all kind of weaving together, and I just find that aspect of it really interesting, and it's making me really excited to see how everything actually comes together, because so far we don't, like, everything is a little bit connected, and like I won't say exactly how, but there's like little hints of everything. But I can only imagine as the book goes on, as we get more little sections, it'll only be more and more connected, and there'll be more and more overarching narrative to follow. But I'm enjoying it so far, and I'm really glad that I pushed past that first feeling of, okay, whatever, because right now I'm thoroughly engaged, and I'm really actually excited to keep on reading. And another thing I want to talk about is this really reminds me of If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler by Italo Calvino, which I picked up earlier this year, really loved. And that's another story that uses a bunch of different shorter narratives within the story to tell an overarching plot. That's a little more experimental than this. That is definitely a weirder book than this, but kind of that same idea of building these different narratives that you're kind of just flipping between is kind of reminding me of that in a good way, in a very good way. And so that's just another connection I wanted to draw in. And maybe if you really like this book, and I won't do this like 100% until I know how everything comes together in this book, but if you do enjoy this book, maybe check out that, because I definitely feel like I send some reference to that. I don't know if the author's directly actually read that and incorporated that, but it really wouldn't surprise me. So I'm excited to keep on reading, and I will check in once I read a little more. I think I'll try to check in after I get to the part where we start going backwards to the narratives we already looked at, because I think that'd be an interesting point. I'm sure something bigger will happen at that point, and I will see you then. Okay, so I got passed through the first 6 parts of the book Cloud Atlas, and I'm honestly really, really enjoying it at this point. I think that I've just really been very amazed with how the author is able to switch from style to style, and these stories are very different in such an impressive way. The writing style is different, the actual like story structure is different for all of these, and I'm just very impressed by all that. But I also just think that these stories have a lot of heart, and I'm really enjoying them individually, even outside of the context of like the wider story that the book is trying to tell. So to give a little recap preview of what the next like 3 stories I've read since I last checked in have been about. The first one I actually really didn't love that much. It was about this publisher who's kind of down on his luck, like he's not really big, he is kind of just like living life, and he doesn't really matter, when everything kind of changes when he has one book that is suddenly doing very well for a reason you find out as you read. And then from there, he's confronted by all of his debtors, and he has to kind of run away. And I don't know, I didn't love that one, but it was still okay. And then from there, we got number 5 and number 6, which are definitely like my favorite, and they definitely solidified that I am really enjoying this. The 5th one is about this like future world where there are these like cloned humans called fabricants that are treated like slaves basically, and we're following one who works in a restaurant, and that's her whole life, but things are starting to change, and we follow her as she's in this restaurant, and then there's an inciting incident, and then her life changes. And that one, I just really liked the explorations of this world. It kind of ended on a cliffhanger that is about to be answered as we start going back through the stories we've already looked at, because that's what the second half of the book is. And so I'm excited to find out about that. I just thought the world was very interesting, and I don't think like this concept is necessarily very, very new, but I liked the way it was explored. I thought the perspective was interesting, and yeah, I was just really impressed by it, especially with the context that like the first 2 stories were like took place in like the 1800s, 1900s, and were about like, one was about a sailing voyage, and one was about this composer, and now we've moved to like sci-fi basically. Just really impressed. And then my absolute favorite one so far is the middle one that only gets 1 section, and it's number 6. And in that story, we're on this island. We're in like a post-apocalyptic world where we don't know exactly what happened, but civilization has basically ended across the world, and we're left with these like warring tribes on this island, and we're following one specific man who's part of one of the tribes as this woman from kind of outside of their bubble of this island enters, and everything changes once again. I know I'm being vague, but I kind of have to be because they're short and I don't want to spoil them. But I really love this one. This one, the writing specifically stands out so well. He writes in a style that's almost like broken English, and it is broken English, and it's kind of mirroring the fact that language has broken down as civilization has broken down. In this one, I just thought that the plot was very well executed, and once again, the world building is incredible, especially in this one. The connections with the previous stories, I got like shivers reading them. I just thought it was so well done, and I'm really excited to see where the rest of the book goes, and I hope there'll be even more connections as we go on. Okay, so I just finished Cloud Atlas literally like 2 seconds ago. I put it away, and my final thoughts are a little more complicated than how I was feeling, especially the last time I checked in. About midway through the book, I was really into it and really loving every second of it. And I will say by the end, I'm still really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, but I think like near that halfway point, I was kind of expecting it to be 5 stars, like a new favorite of mine. And I wouldn't quite say I got there. I'm very impressed by this book and everything it sets out to do, and it does everything it sets out to do well. I just think personally it had some things in it that didn't work as well for me because of my personal preferences. So just for my thoughts aren't completely fully formed, but just for like what I'm thinking right now, all 6 of these stories are about power and exploitation and humanity's proclivity towards power and exploitation, and what that means in these different contexts. But also then by the end we get kind of a reflection, and the reflection on that is, I don't want to give too much away, but it has kind of a nuanced take on it. Fine. And so especially by the end, I can look back and say every single story I read, even the ones that in like the first half I wasn't huge on, which were like the old sailing story, it's the first one, and the one about the publisher who has to run away and something bad happens, keeping it vague. I didn't love those in the first half. I really liked how they went in the second half. I really loved every story. There's some parts in here that I thought were absolutely incredible, and probably some of my favorite pieces of fiction I've read this year. And overall, as I've been saying throughout, it's very impressively stylistic, like the writing choices and the way that everything meshes together to have this cohesive theme. I think it works well. What didn't work necessarily that well for me is, even though I think like the thematic through line was very present, and I think the way everything kind of flowed into each other made sense, I wasn't necessarily huge on some of the more in-your-face aspects of that. I think especially like the last moments in this book, it's literally a main character reflecting on the theme, and it felt like a little shoved in my face. I was like, okay, I kind of got it. I didn't need like you to end the book with just like saying it back to me. I think it kind of took away from kind of the subtler parts of the book that I liked. And also I do think that like without the greater context, there are some stories in here that are just like, they're good, but they're not like mind-blowing, and they only really work because of that larger context. And I feel kind of complicated about that, because in one sense, like, it is a full book, and so if it makes sense in that larger context, that's fine, that's good. But even though I said like I really enjoyed the first story by the end, it wasn't like mind-blowingly good. Like, it was fine, it was good. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed how it ended. There's a point within the book, and this is another like very on the nose moment, where this character is talking about the titular like Cloud Atlas sextet that's being composed in one of the stories, and he's like discussing it. It's like a mirror of how the book basically works, and he literally asks the reader gimmick or something else, or the other thing, but he asks if it's a gimmick. And I don't think it's a gimmick. Like, I think it's done well, I truly do, but I think there were aspects of it that at times felt gimmicky when it was more like shoved in your face, and there were points where there's almost too much given to me where I would just prefer it to be a little more subtle. All that to be said, once again, still gave it 4 stars, still really enjoyed it, was very impressed, and would highly recommend it because it is just so impressive to read, and it's fun to see all the connections and see the stories inside of the stories. And I think like everyone loves this book, and I understand why, and I still love it. It just wasn't necessarily the favorite book that I thought it was going to be halfway through. But I understand completely why it is so many people's like favorite book or really up there for them. I'm actually going to end the vlog here. Overall, this vlog went very well. I mean, as if I'm measuring the success of the New York Times list, and you can check out the first video I did where I talked about the books I'd already read, I really enjoyed most of the books that I had already read that were on the list, and I enjoyed to varying degrees all 3 of these new books that I read that I was interested in on the list. So I would say, yes, I have issues with the idea of the New York Times list, and there are many critiques of the list, but overall the books I've read from the list have mostly ranged from good to amazing. So success in my book. I don't know what it says. I don't have like a broader message about lists to send. I don't think this proves that lists are good, but this is kind of just a fun little experiment, and I'm glad I did it because I got some great reads out of it. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video, this journey, and learning about these books with me, because I certainly had a good time. And if you did, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if there are any books from the New York Times list that you've read recently that you now want to read, and if they've gone well or if you think they will go well. And I will see you in the next one.